Live. I am Gaius in Londinium. Germanicus is here. We're at our wine bar by the Thames. A beautiful, soft summer evening. The summer solstice has passed. Those druids who worry us sometimes have had their ceremony at Stonehenge and their other gathering places. They don't much come into Londinium, and when they do, they're pretty obvious. They drag around acting holy. Well, that's the druids. It's summertime, and it's reflective of kick back and philosophize, except we get word from the 21st century, a new battlefront. There is some debate about the word war, so we will not settle that debate. The vice president, Mr. Vance, has said, paraphrase, we're not at war with Iran, we're at war with the Iranian nuclear weapons program. That is unusually careful. We'll go along with the idea that at war is the important part of that sentence. Germanicus, a very good evening to you. In considering that the U.S. has launched a preemptive strike on what we're told are the suspect nuclear weapons sites in Iran, Isfahan, Parchin, I believe, and Fordow being the mountain that requires the attention of B-2 stealth bombers, and the big bomb, the MOPS. We're told there were 12 of them dropped. We do not have any reason to believe that they were successful or not successful. I'm certain that I've read very carefully that bomb assessment is extremely difficult from the air, and that it takes a great deal of time. You gather metrics, you decide what the site is doing after you've bombed it. You can kill the people, but to destroy a site with accuracy and high probability is very challenging, even for the supermen at the Pentagon. So we'll set that aside, and I'll frame this question to you another way. Russia attacked Ukraine because it said that it was drifting into the EU and NATO, and Russia found NATO a threat to its sovereignty. Ukraine wanted to be a member of the EU, and it's a candidate now, and they tell it all the time. Ukraine wanted to be a member of NATO. It's a candidate now, and they tell it now and again. That's the way we think we should go. We come over to Iran. Iran is a revisionist state, yes, but it's also a member of BRICS, invited by Russia and China. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and Iran is a member. So is Venezuela. It's also, Iran, a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that was established by China some years ago. Therefore, we're looking at Iran integrated into a separate but co-equal transnational series of organizations that are chiefly about trade, but also about self-defense. We've attacked a member of that alliance, as Russia attacked a member of our alliance. This is what Oscar Wilde would call a distinction without a difference. Help me, Germanicus. How do we solve this? Good evening to you.
Good evening, guys. This is, in many ways, a kind of firming up of a conflict that's been gathering force for some time, a struggle between two emerging successor systems. In the Cold War, there was the so-called free world, and then there was the communist world until the Sino-Soviet split, at least. And then a putative sort of third way emerged called the Third World after the Bandung Conference. And though that was the system struggle that everyone talked about then. And it really seems after a relatively short period in which the U.S. was the world empire after 1991, that has not only drawn to a close, but we can see the outlines of a struggle, or maybe just a competition, between two alternative systems. And the the BRICS system is actually cohering now, especially the Eurasian part of it. And the Belt and Road Initiative that China poured $1 trillion or more into in our dollars, it seems to be paying off because Iran provides for a significant slice of China's energy needs. And you could look at a war with Iran as having one of its aims to squeeze China, just as the war through Ukraine as a proxy had the goal of squeezing Russia, bringing it down, and thus weakening China. But, China has made counter moves, one of them being the completion just several weeks ago of a rail hub connecting Tehran with Beijing, so that Iran can now ship straight across, the Silk Road to China, all that China might need, although it's hard to do that with rail alone. But the fact is that there is this shift, and the war is more likely to firm up the shift than it is to achieve whatever strategic goals are sought by the initiator of the attack. So Russia's attack on Ukraine, which has been successful in its main goal of stopping the westward expansion of NATO to bring Russia down, has also sort of firmed up a solid line. And the sort of iron curtain between East and West, between these two new systems, has taken or is coalescing right now. Let's put it that way. And a similar kind of line is emerging in the South with Iran, and we don't know about places like Saudi Arabia, which is on the fence, which is trying to maintain relations with us and Israel, but also at the same time petitioning for joining the BRICS. India is also fence-sitting, so is Turkey. So in many ways, what we're looking at is the initial phase of this struggle. It hasn't frozen itself as it did in the Cold War, where you can actually, as Winston Churchill did, use the metaphor of an iron curtain to define something that solid and that immovable. But it looks like we're heading in that direction, and it looks like both sides are aggressively moving toward that. The U.S., of course, is using proxies really to make this happen, Israel and Ukraine, and because the U.S. is not in a position to send its legions abroad. It exhausted them in the great Muslim War of 2001 to 2021.
Germanicus, it occurred to me as you were very carefully explicating where we are, I'm thinking around for an analogy that would make sense to the historians in the 21st century. And I don't know why it pops into my mind now and again, because it's a romantic tale that Hollywood changed profoundly. Rasooli. Bring me Paris alive or bring me Rasooli dead.
Yeah. Paris alive or Rasooli dead.
And it was during the campaign of 1904. The burst of applause at Chicago as they were nominating Roosevelt for Teddy Roosevelt for a second term. It's not the Rasooli part that I'm thinking of. It's that all the warships that would eventually become the powers in the First War showed up. Everybody was claiming a piece of North Africa. It was the drive for colonial empire. The Germans were there, the Japanese were there, the French were there, the British clearly, and the Americans. And entanglement meant the U.S. got involved in a way that we were the junior partner at that point, 1904. And I'm thinking we've just got caught up in their business. This is not our business. we've never been at war with Iran, ever, or Persia beforehand. But this is the great game, Germanicus.
Well,
I know that the newspaper audience is not being helped to understand the great game has been going on for several hundred years.
it's good you bring that up because shortly after the little contretemps in Morocco with the Raizuli,
Yes.
there was another, not so much a crisis, but a kind of face-off between Britain and Russia over Iran. And both countries had big business in Iran, and both countries wanted Iran. And Iran was one of only three countries, in the ambit of imperialism that had stayed independent. The others being Ethiopia and Siam or Thailand. And there was an agreement finally in 1908 between Britain and Russia in which the two decided to divide the country. I think the reason they didn't go to war is that Russia was a deep ally of France, and Britain had just signed the Entente Cordiale with France. And so I think there was a kind of cooling off of this intense animosity between Russia and England, which is, of course, still going on. And Iran was completely humiliated and essentially owned by the two empires, the British and the Russian. And this is something that continued again after World War II. And of course, during World War II, Iran was completely owned by the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States. And so there's this long, heavy weight on Iran, and now it returns again.
The Tehran meeting of the Allies.
Yes.
Now, I don't want to go too far with this because the distinctions are emerging. But it occurs to me that we should say here just for a moment before we move on to the political dynamism back in the U.S. on this, that our statements of the reason we're defending Ukraine is because after us, Russia invades Europe. That's going to be turned on us, Michael. That's Germanicus. They're going to say to their Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, Pyongyang, whoever else is sympathetic in Central Asia, is going to hear from the statement saying the reason they're bombing Iran is because they're coming for you.
Yes. And of course, the obvious fallacy in bombing Iran, and this, of course, includes the Israeli campaign first and foremost, is that hurting Iran only it will have the opposite effect. There's no way in which the people of Iran are going to say, let's overthrow this evil, religious theocracy and embrace the United States and Israel. It's incredible that should even be mentioned. And so there is now a greater and greater conviction that the U.S. is pushing in the Middle East, as it did in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, is pushing to overthrow Russia and now Iran. And that is the worst thing we could do strategically, because certainly we can hurt Iran just as we hurt Russia, and yet in many ways they come back stronger, because when you hurt somebody, that strengthens them. That gives them a greater resolution and will and a determination to bring the fight to you. And China can only benefit from this, because Taiwan is the third proxy. It's the proxy that is least willing, in contrast to Israel and Ukraine, it's the least willing proxy to do our bidding, because they know they'll be destroyed. And so in many ways, what we think of through Iran hurting China, perhaps, is actually achieving the exact opposite effect.
Germanicus, is Machiavellios. Gaius is John Batchelor. We're in Londinium, enjoying ourselves, speculating about the 21st century. We're going to turn to Republican Party politics, which, of course, is not for us. It's not what we do. But we've noticed that there's a new dynamism in terms of a split within the party that was very successful in electing President Trump, but is now at odds with itself. And when we come back, what does this mean for the immediate future, and what does this reflect? What does this reflect in the Republican Party? I mean, since the beginning. I mean, since 1854. When we come back, this is the Friends of History Debating Society. We're in Londinium. It's a pleasant summer evening. We're getting very speculative, but right now, there's reason to believe that what was assumed to be stable, that would be the war in Ukraine and the Israeli conflict with Iran, is not stable at all. No, everything's changing. Sides are going to be changing soon enough. We'll be right back. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here. The beautiful summer evening by the Thames in Londinium, the year 91 AD. Domitian is our emperor, and we don't get excited in talking about him, even though we probably could. The walls have ears in Rome, but not here at the edge of the empire. We're surrounded by extremely successful retired centurions, having served all over the empire, from the Syrian deserts to the cold of Caledonia. That would be Boudica and her gang, north of us. They've seen everything. They've had their various legios disgraced or rewarded through the last 90 years, very carefully participating in the building of the empire, which will peak in a few more years. However, they're confident, and we're confident, but we're looking at the 21st century, where all of a sudden it occurs to us that what we had assumed were small wars that were stabilizing are building into larger conflict. Why I mentioned Razzouli and Perdicaris and Morocco and Teddy Roosevelt before is because now, looking back, you can see that as a predicate for what was to come in 1914, the destruction of the empires of Europe. Are we looking at the destruction of empires right now in the 21st century? Don't know. But the Republican Party within the United States is demanding our attention. Germanicus, I put it this way. Since 1854, the Republicans have had a single theme, and it's been repeated now and again every few generations. And it's a simple declaration. It's liberty. That's their theme. And it worked for the Civil War. It worked for the Gilded Age. It worked for the wars of the 20th century. Liberty. It was compatible with the Constitution, with the flag, and not in any fashion at odds with the Democratic Party's themes, which have changed since the 19th century because that was the party associated with the slavocracy. It changed profoundly in the 20th century. In any event, liberty is not at odds with the Democratic Party. But now we have a split, or what appears to be a split in the Republican Party, over whether liberty is to be extended, visited upon the Eurasian nation states that are without liberty. And is that the Republican Party's job to project, to preach liberty, to back it up with 30,000-pound bombs from stealth bombers of the 22nd century? And I would say right now the younger members of the Republican Party are decidedly not convinced that Iran is our business, that Israel's war with Iran is our business, that we have no business in Ukraine, that Ukraine's war with Russia is none of our business. I could go on. And I do not see this split settling itself easily. How do you see it, Germanicus?
It's a fundamental split, and it's a split that emerges in both parties when both parties happened to be in power. So you had that split emerge among Democrats under Biden, and it was the progressives who cavilled at the idea of war with Ukraine, and they were immediately shut down because they were a tremulous marginal minority at that time, given the enormously powerful grip of the Democrat Party establishment. However, there's a different kind of balance of power in the Republican universe, because it was a populist movement that was essentially in rebellion against the idea of unfettered American world proselytism. The U.S. as the missionary messianic force in the world, especially as it manifested after 9/11, in the care of Republican administrations, at least two. Then there was John McCain, who remained until the end of his life a torchbearer of this messianism on the part of America. But the rebellion, the populist rebellion, did not want to continue to go down that road, and it was really born of the fecklessness and the terrible sacrifice that Americans endured in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so it's come to a head here in the form of a split, and yet the populist side of the party, which was critical to electing Mr. Trump, is now, not so unlike the progressives in the Democratic Party, finds itself more marginalized and not in the positions of power that give them the kind of leverage that they need to see their agenda enacted, which is a restrainer agenda, as they call it. And so that puts that opened a seam that could be exploited by the most missionary group in America, who are often called neocons, and they have managed to reassert themselves. And they are now apparently in the saddle, and they're in key positions in the administration, lobbying for a complete war, not unlike the wars we fought after 9/11, against Iran.
Now we turn to the question of what is to be done about this, especially because the younger members of MAGA are decidedly against intervention. And I believe that it's fair to assume, without actually proving, that the leader of the younger members is the president, Mr. Vance, who's 40 years old. That means the future of the Republican Party must take into account this opinion that it's none of our affair. They're not isolationists.
No.
That isn't the way they think. They think about what's in it for us. That's not isolationism. That's a very practical question. And that connects us to the understanding that we're living through old alliances, Germanicus.
This skein of thought really goes back to Washington and the farewell address. And there's always been a thread in American thought and in American politics that spreading liberty by force abroad will corrupt us and eventually destroy us. And therefore, we can do what we can to promote freedom and democracy and to support democratic movements, but not through force, and that this is the road to perdition. And that's always at the same time, ultimately, however, been a minority in American political power, and when it comes to wars. And so it's a real problem, I think, for this president, because he should know that the future of the party lies in its youth, and they have a different worldview than the kind of aggressive um, messianic imperialism that has failed and failed badly. And when it failed in the global war on terror, a lot of Republicans moved in the direction of the Democrats and ended up voting for Mr. Obama. And this is something that I think the administration should take very seriously, because if you lose the high moral standard that brought so many to rally around, both in 2016, but especially in 2024, and you lose them, then this will give the Democrats an opportunity to ally with them, and it will be the end of this second short period of power for the Republicans. So there are a lot of dynamics under the surface that the administration should be very seriously take into account.
The only genuine intellectual ever to occupy the Oval Office, well, it wasn't Oval at the time. It was Quincy Adams, early Republic, July 4th, 1821. America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. America might become the dictatress of the world. She would be no longer the ruler of her own spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was another intellectual who had a PhD, the only president who had a PhD, president of Princeton, who had a very different idea, and we can see what happened. Americans turned against Wilson, and there was a huge America First movement throughout the period between the wars, because they felt betrayed. And the last thing that Mr. Trump should want is to come to be seen as a president who betrayed the vision of America.
We're going to turn to Rome and the Persian Empire, sometimes called the Parthian Empire, when we come back, because as Romans, we've done the best we can in our American temperament to talk about the 21st century. But there are certain groups, empires, people you bring up, and it gives us pause. And the Parthians are one of them. Parthian is occupied 500 years or more, the same territory as good Iran does. So you have the Persians who fought the Greeks, Thermopylae, who was on the other side, the Persians. You had Alexander conquer the Persian Empire, but die immediately thereafter. And the Parthians emerged from the dividing up of Alexander's conquest. When we come back, what about Rome and Parthia? What gives us the creeps? This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. He's Germanicus. The Centurions are enjoying listening to us. They're very cheerful young men. We'll be right back. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're Roman citizens. And though we have this odd ability to see every century between now and the 21st century, when we reflect upon analogies, we remember always that we're Romans and we have certain temperaments that are sort of knitted into being Roman. We're living in Londinium, so we're very far from Rome, but that's because politics as we practice it would be dangerous in Rome. So we turn to, what does Rome worry about? We've gone over and over and over that Rome worries about the Dacians, sometimes said Dacians. Depends on whether you're going to be fussy or not and talk like Cicero. And the emperors that have crashed up against it, including Domitian, will never completely succeed in solving that story. And in the 21st century, the Romanians remember all of it. The Dacians are still there. The Dacians are still there. They smile in Romania when the Dacian name comes up because they were never really conquered by Rome. Rome battered down their city, destroyed their capital, and yet never really satisfied what you'd have to do to make a people subservient. Now, we come to what worries us in addition to the Dacians, and that's the Parthians. Richest man in Rome, meaning the richest man in the world, Crassus, part of the triumvirate, Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus. Crassus decides he needs glory. So he and his son take an expedition. This is while Caesar is challenging no one. This is before Caesar moves. And Pompey is the great hero, Pompey the Great. And it travels to Parthia, which is, picture it, this is what we call Mesopotamia. And Crassus is no war leader, but he wants to be recognized as one. And he allows himself to be cut off and surrounded by the Parthians, who utterly destroy his army, utterly. They kill his son, his son commits suicide when he's surrounded by the Parthians. And they mock Crassus because his son is braver than Crassus. But everything is destroyed, and that lesson is transmitted back to Rome. However, a little detail here. Caesar, the day of his death, was going to tell the Senate that he was leaving for his Parthian expedition. Caesar was going to pick up the mantle and conquer Parthia when he was murdered by Brutus and the gang. The emperors that followed Caesar, Parthia was a thing for them. It was the way they proved that they were in charge. And they kept crashing against Parthia. What is this warning about? The Greeks couldn't solve it. Alexander could. The Romans couldn't solve it. Germanicus has already said how the British and the Russians couldn't solve it. And we convey to the 21st century, this is not Afghanistan, backwards and medieval. This is not Iraq, divided between the Kurds and the Shiite and the Sunni. This is Persia. Can I convey to you enough? This is the unconquered Persia. Unless you consider Alexander the equal of Donald Trump and the NATO alliance, Germanicus, it makes me smile because I don't think the Americans understand what I'm talking about.
The Romans, from the time of Crassus all the way up to the reign of Heraclius in the 620s and early 30s, fought the Persians for almost 700 years. And it's murky as to why they felt the need to keep pushing into Persian lands. There was a strategic reason, in the sense that between the lowlands of Syria and the Anatolia, there is this sort of shatter belt or strategic glacis, a kind of contentious area called northern Mesopotamia, which are the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates River. But to occupy that is difficult, and to keep it is even harder. And so if you look at this 700 years of back and forth, the Romans are continually trying to hold on to northern Mesopotamia and occasionally trying to topple the Persian Empire itself by marching downriver to Tisfan, which is the imperial capital, where the Tigris and Euphrates are close to each other. It's not exactly where Baghdad is today, but it's close. And so this struggle was the death of a number of Roman armies, beginning with Crassus. But then later armies, the Emperor Valerian in the 3rd century was defeated by the Persians, by Shapur, and he was captured. And there's a great bas-relief sculpture of 30, 40 feet high showing Valerian prostrate in front of Shapur. And it is a terribly humiliating thing, must have been even more so for the Romans. And yet they kept trying to invade. Julian, also known as the Apostate, invaded with one of the finest armies Rome ever fielded in 363, and his army was destroyed. He was killed before the gates of Ctesiphon. It was just very hard strategic terrain for a Roman army, and yet they kept trying to cross it. The one time that they did well was under Trajan, and the only reason Trajan was able to take Ctesiphon and hold it for just a few years, he really had to leave because there were rebellions in the upper Mesopotamia, and he couldn't quell them. But the only reason that he succeeded, arguably, is that the Parthian Empire was falling apart and was about to be succeeded by the Sasanian Empire, who were true Iranians from the Iranian plateau, by the way. And so it was always a bad scene. And it kind of is reminiscent, too, of the wars that Britain fought during the height of the Great Game in the 19th century, the 3 wars they fought in Afghanistan. And they could never really subdue Afghanistan. They kept trying to go into Central Asia. And sadly, the U.S. has fallen into this pattern. And I don't know why, because there is no way that the U.S. could ever hope to subdue or even strongly, shall we say, penetrate into Iran. It would be a hopeless task. And the U.S. was defeated pretty badly in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and it's almost as though we haven't learned. There would be no way to force Iran to be a client state of the U.S. empire. And I just do not know why we keep going back to the well again and again, like the British did, and before them for 700 years, like the Romans.
And the deeper we get into this discussion, we'll tell more stories. We're leaving out the CIA coup that brought back the Shah in 1953. We're leaving out important details about the Iranian Revolution in 1975, 79, and 80, the way Jimmy Carter handled it. We're concentrating on how we Romans worry about this. And you remind me, Germanicus, to mention that we're looking at a part of the world where Rome was at least willing to recognize there was a border. You know, there was them and there was us. Sending aircraft over Iran without a declaration of war and using first-rate materials to bomb Iran, that is inviting a provocation, isn't it?
Well, it is a provocation, and it is no better than George W. Bush fabricating a lie about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, or for that matter, Lyndon Johnson insisting that U.S. destroyers had been attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. I mean, this sort of aggression masked by lies really undercuts whatever moral high ground, to use that cliche, the U.S. still possesses.
We're mentioning, as Romans, it worries us. As Americans, it should worry you. But it doesn't, not yet. You know, not yet. Germanicus says, Michael Vlaos, we're going on to the sacrifice to Augustus, who I believe recovered, yes, I'm sure he recovered the 3rd standard. We lost 3 standards for Crassus, and the 2 of them were recovered right away. This is very important to Roman legions to have their standard recovered if it falls in battle. And I believe the 3rd standard was recovered before Augustus died. It was very important to him.
Well, it was, and the Romans had leverage because they had they had the Persian prince. So the Shah wanted the prince back. He didn't mind handing over the standards that looked like a good exchange.
Just mention, this is not an ordinary empire. This is not, name an ordinary empire, John. It's not the Hohenzollerns, okay? they've got history about being unconquered, and they've backed it up for several thousand years. And America's not going to be, unless Germanicus. We'll put it this way: the Republican Party should ask itself, is Donald Trump Alexander the Great? That's a question, right?
Yes, it is.
Just a question. He certainly went through the American public as if he's Alexander the Great, but overseas? All right, we're going on to the theater tonight. They're not announcing the schedule anymore. I think the attendance has been slipping whenever they come up with that heavy duty, tragic Greek stuff. We'll tell you what we find next week. The skies are pleasant, however. It'll be a joy just to sit in the theater and laugh. I am Germanicus. I am Gaius. He is Germanicus. This is Londinium live. Thank you for attending. And if we seem entertained by these stories, it's because we've read a couple of details about the Parthians. They're extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. They're very good at being deceptive. Much better than America. I'm John Batchelor.